In this video, I will give a full step-by-step tutorial on how to build a Mini QBiT V2, an aircraft that can hover like a quadcopter and fly like an airplane. I will first explain how to make a visual line of sight flying Mini QBiT, and then how to build the FPV version, which will use the same components as the visual line of sight Mini QBiT, but adding some extra components that allow for first-person view. The Mini QBiT, which includes the frame, nose cone, and carbon fiber wings, is available on miniqbit.com. Everything can be easily disassembled and reassembled using magnets which hold everything together and allow for disassembly in a crash, thereby protecting the parts from breaking. The frame is made from 3D printed carbon fiber nylon, which provides excellent strength and durability, while allowing for some flexibility to absorb impacts in a crash. The frame has options for 16x16 and 20x20mm flight controller mounting on the surface of the frame. There's also additional 20x20mm mounting for extra components such as a VTX, which can be mounted to the side of the frame. The motor mount allows for a variety of motors thanks to its 9 to 12mm diameter slot design. The front of the frame has mounting for a 19mm width FPV camera, which also includes a slot to allow for a variety of cameras. There's also a zip tie mount on the back for mounting antennas horizontally. The inside of the frame has Velcro included, which is used to mount the battery. The Velcro alone is strong enough as it will keep the battery in place during flight, but eject it in a crash. However, there's also optional rubber band mounts which can be used to further fasten the battery in place, although they are not necessary as the battery is held well enough with the Velcro alone. Depending on whether you choose to fly the Mini QBiT line of sight or in FPV mode, there are two different types of nose cones, one without a camera mount and one with a camera mount. Personally, I would recommend people buy the FPV version because it's much easier to fly. In the FPV nose cone, there's a slot for a second 19mm camera, which fits in the top of the nose cone. The nose cone is also made from 3D printed carbon fiber nylon, which is also very durable and helps protect the sensitive electronics on the frame. The wings are 2-ply aerospace-grade carbon fiber. They are incredibly strong and lightweight, and you'll have a very difficult time breaking them in a crash. For more detailed dimensions, visit miniqbit.com and tab over to the tech specs page, which has all of the important dimensions listed. For the electronics, you'll need to source them yourself, but there are links to help you find components which will work on miniqbit.com, although I recommend you verify their fit once more by checking the tech specs page on the website. To start, we'll focus on the visual line of sight Mini QBiT, which does not include the FPV parts. For this build, I'm using the 20x20mm HGLRC F728 stack mini flight controller with a 4-in-1 ESC. For the motors, I'm using the iFlight 1404 4600 kV motors. You'll also need a receiver that works with your transmitter. In this case, I'm using the FrSky S-Bus receiver. For the rotors, I'm using 3-inch propellers, which seem to have already gone out of stock on Amazon. But any 3-inch rotors will work, although you'll want to maximize pitch for forward flight efficiency. We'll start by mounting the 4 motors to the frame. Make sure to check that the motor screw length isn't so long that they poke into the motor copper wiring, which could damage the motor. Have your wires point into the frame so that the wire length can be shortened as much as possible. I also zip-tied the cables to the frame, but you could also use electrical tape. Feed the wire up and through the slots on the surface of the frame. For now, you can leave the entire wire length as is, and we will trim them to size later. Next, we'll mount the 4-in-1 ESC to the frame. We'll start by adding the little red vibration mounts into the holes in the ESC. This can be a little bit difficult, but generally twisting them in is easiest. I'm also adding some double-stick foam tape to the surface of the frame to elevate the ESC slightly. We'll then mount the ESC to the frame. Be sure to mount it in such a way that the motor wires can still reach the ESC pads while also making sure that the nose cone can still mount properly. In this case, I'm mounting the ESC sideways as it will fit the frame and nose cone better in this orientation. We'll then insert the 4 screws into the frame. You may need to drill out the hole slightly larger in order to fit the screws. The frame is designed for M2 screws, but in this case they are slightly larger, so I needed to drill them out a bit. Next, I will cut the motor wires to size so that they can be soldered to the ESC while keeping a clean look. It's important to minimize wiring at the center of the frame, as it will get pretty compact later on, and we'll still want to mount the nose cone easily, which won't be possible with too many wires dangling around. I'll apply solder to all the ESC pads, then to the motor leads, and then solder both together, constantly checking to make sure that the nose cone can still fit correctly. Again, it's very important to make sure that all of your wires are nicely secured and won't get in the way of the nose cone. We'll then add the flight controller and mount the cable for communicating from the flight controller to the ESC. I also make sure to push the little cable in between the flight controller and ESC. I'll then screw on the lock nuts to secure the flight controller and ESC together. Your flight controller, ESC, and motors should look something like this. Next, I will add the battery connector. I pre-tin the ESC battery leads and do the same for the XT30 connector provided with the flight controller. I then solder the capacitor to reduce battery noise, and then solder the XT30 connector pointing down through the slot on the surface of the frame. Next, we'll connect the receiver to the flight controller. You'll want to check the flight controller manual to see how to connect the receiver wires to the flight controller. In this case, I'm only connecting 5 volts, ground, and the S-bus wire. I then apply some more double stick tape and mount the receiver to the surface of the flight controller. I can then add the nose cone, which should fit without too much trouble. If something is still jutting out from the flight controller or ESC, you can always cut away at the nose cone in order to make it fit. And that's it. The visual line of sight build is done. I will add some tape to the motors so that we can check the motor spin direction. We'll now get into the Betaflight firmware, which is the software used to control the Mini QBiT just like a standard quadcopter, except with some extra changes. We'll plug in the micro USB cable and hit connect in Betaflight. We'll check to make sure that the gyro and accelerometer are working correctly by moving the quad around. I then hold the flight controller very still on a flat table and hit calibrate accelerometer. In this case, the first gyro is flipped, so I will need to change the orientation from clockwise 180 degrees to clockwise 0 degrees. You may also need to change the orientation of the board by changing the yaw angle. I'll then hit save and reboot and reconnect. We'll then check the viewer once more to verify that the movement of the real vehicle correlates with the one shown in Betaflight. Next, we'll go into the PID tuning section and set the strength and angle limit to 90 degrees. You may want to actually set it to 85 or 80 degrees, as 90 degrees will lead to gimbal lock in stabilized mode, which will cause some issues in forward flight mode. So 85 or 80 degrees is probably a better bet for this. To prevent gimbal lock in full forward flight, you can fly the Mini QBiT in acro or rate mode, which will prevent gimbal lock, but also make it more difficult to fly line of sight, which is why I recommend you fly it in FPV mode. You can also change the gains however you like, but for now I will leave them to the stock settings, which work quite well. I'll then go into the configuration tab and set the receiver to the correct receiver that I'm using. In this case, it's already set to the correct setting with the FrSky S-Bus. Next, I will go into the FrSky Tyrannus and create a new model, which is a quadcopter. I'll hit OK on all of the channels it asks for and create the model name, which I'm calling MQB. I'll then follow the binding procedure to connect my transmitter to the receiver. Next, I will go into the receiver tab and check to make sure that the receiver is giving me the correct outputs. For this step, you may need to plug in a battery to the quadcopter to give the receiver power. I'll change the channel map so that my stick inputs correlate correctly with roll, pitch, yaw, and throttle. I'll then create a mix to set a switch on the transmitter to control the arming of the quadcopter. Then, in Betaflight, I will go to the Modes tab and set the arming tab so that the quad is armed when the transmitter stick is pointing up. I'll then create a second switch in the Mixes tab on the transmitter, which will be used to control the switch between angle mode and acro mode. In Betaflight, I will set the change to aux2 and then adjust the sliders in the same way as the arming mode. Next, I will plug in a battery to give the ESC power. I will then go into the Motors tab and turn motor 1 on, and use a sheet to write down which motor it's actually turning on the quadcopter. This is important because the motors might not be soldered to the same motor layout set in Betaflight. I'll do the same again for motors 2, 3, and 4. I'll then go to the CLI tab in Betaflight and type in dump and hit enter. I'll scroll up and find the motor resources, which label the motors to the corresponding output on the ESC. On our sheet, we'll write down the output that corresponds to the motor output set in Betaflight. For motor 3, it's B00. For motor 4, it's B01. Motor 1, it's B04, and for motor 2, it's B05. We'll write these down next to the number we wrote down on the right of our sheet. We'll then reassign the motor resources in Betaflight by correlating motors 1, 2, 3, and 4 to the new outputs, which we write down on the far right side of the sheet. We'll then go into Betaflight, copy the first motor resource, and reassign the output to the new output, which we wrote on the far right side of the sheet. In this case, motor 1 will be reassigned to B00, and we'll do the same for motors 2, 3, and 4. We'll then type in save and hit enter. We'll reconnect, go to the Motors tab, and check to make sure that each motor in Betaflight is spinning the correct motor on the real-world quad. Next, we'll check to make sure that the motor spin direction is correct on all 4 motors. In this case, motor 2 is the only one spinning the incorrect way. We'll go into BL Heli, which is a separate app used to change the ESC firmware. We'll hit Read Setup and then set the ESCs with the incorrect spin direction to reversed, and then hit Right Setup. We'll then go back into the Motors tab and verify that each motor is rotating the correct way. And with that, all of the Betaflight stuff for the visual line of sight Mini QBiT is done. You can now unplug the USB from the flight controller and unplug the battery. We'll now put the rotors on. Make sure that the rotors are pointed inward. That is, mount them in the standard way and not reversed. We'll then mount the nose cone back onto the frame. And with that, the visual line of sight Mini QBiT is complete. If you're building the FPV version, I recommend you check that everything works by flying it before moving on to adding the FPV stuff. Alright, so I've got the Mini QBiT here, the VLOS visual line of sight version. I'm going to plug in a battery and fly it and just make sure everything works. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that the pitch stick and the roll and everything are corresponding the way they should. So I'm going to fly in angle mode in here. So first of all, check that the pitch is working, so that seems to be working well. Roll is also working properly, and our yaw is also working as it should. So once I know that those are all doing what they're supposed to do, and that my pilot commands are telling the quadrotor to do what it's supposed to do, I feel confident to take off and actually fly. So here I'll start to give throttle, and we'll go into a hover. And we'll transition to forward flight. Don't have much room in here because I'm inside, but thankfully I've flown these so much now, I kind of know how it goes. Seems to be working. Okay, now onto the FPV Mini QBiT. We'll grab all of the parts we need, which includes the VTX, 2 cameras, and a video switcher. We'll start by removing the props and removing the nuts that hold the flight controller in place. I'll then take the flight controller off and pre-tin the pads for the camera, VTX wires, and LED pad, which we will use to control the switch on the video switcher. We'll then solder the same wires to the LED pad into the camera output, which includes the signal wire, 5 volts, and ground. We'll then solder the VTX wires to the flight controller. In this case, I'm adding a plug on the power wire, which can be used to manually power off the VTX. We'll then remount the flight controller with a new set of wires back onto the 4 screws from earlier, and then mount the VTX on top. The VTX can also be mounted to the side of the frame using the second set of 20 by 20 mm mounting holes if it doesn't fit inside the nose cone. The side mounting holes can also give the VTX extra cooling, but I prefer keeping a cleaner look, so I'm putting it on top of the flight controller in the same stack. I then add some extra vibration isolation O-rings to the screws and fasten the lock nuts in place. When that's done, you should have your ESC, flight controller, and VTX stack complete. Make sure that the antenna mount on the VTX is pointing a direction where it will be easy to leave the nose cone, so it will need to point either towards the front or back. And I would recommend pointing it in the opposite direction of the receiver antennas. Next, we'll grab our first camera. In this case, I'm using the RunCam Nano 2, which requires adding some extra plastic housing which comes with the camera. Although, you can use a nicer camera like the RunCam Racer 3. I always like to add some super glue to the back of the camera where the 3 wires come out to prevent the wires from ripping off the pads on the back of the camera. We'll then mount the camera to the front of the frame and screw it into place using the slot holes on the side. The camera mount is set to 25 degrees, although you can adjust this as you'd like by rotating it about the mounting screws. We'll then grab the FPV nose cone and mount the second camera inside it. The nose cone curve is designed to blend with the camera lens, so be sure to mount the camera lens flush with the nose cone for a cleaner look. We'll then screw the camera in place using the slots on the side of the nose cone. Now we'll work on the video switcher. Some flight controllers already have the ability to switch camera feeds, so check this first before purchasing a video switcher. We'll start by applying solder to the video switcher pads. We'll then solder 5 volts and ground to the video switcher. We'll solder the wire that went to the LED pad to the PWM input on the video switcher, because we'll be using it to control the switch between the 2 cameras. So what we're doing here is we plug in 2 cameras into the AVN1 and AVN2 ports on the camera switching module. We then plug in 5 volts and ground for both the cameras and the camera switching module. And then we plug in AV out into the camera port on the flight controller. We then plug in a PWM signal from the flight controller into the camera switching module. Most beta flight boards do not have a PWM output pad, so in this case we're using an LED pad, which will work just as well. We'll then use some plugs for the camera, which I strongly recommend you also use, because if the nose cone pops off in a crash, you'll want something to unplug the camera rather than ripping off the wires from the camera. We'll cut them to size for the front camera and the nose cone camera, and then wrap some heat shrink over the entire video switcher to keep the wires secured in place. The video switcher also has a little red LED on it, so I will cut away at the heat shrink after shrinking it in order to expose the LED. Next, I will zip tie the front camera wire to the arm and plug it in. I will then clean up all of the wiring by pushing it into the flight controller stack. Next, I will zip tie the receiver antennas to the antenna mount on the back of the frame and spread out the 2 antennas. In the end, everything should be super compact and tight inside of the nose cone, especially if you are using a 20 by 20 millimeter stack. And lastly, I will mount the 4 propellers. And with that, the FPV Mini QBiT build is done. Now we'll plug the Mini QBiT back into Betaflight and adjust some things to work with the FPV cameras. We'll connect the flight controller and enable expert mode, which will show us some more tabs which we will need. Then we'll go back into the CLI and type in dump. We'll then go up again to the Resources tab and find the resource assigned to Servo 1 and LED strip 1. We'll then want to switch the outputs between these two, which will reassign the LED strip to a servo output. Be sure to take note of the LED resource, which is A08 in this case. We'll copy the LED strip resource and replace the output with none. Then we'll go back up and copy the servo output and reassign it to the same output that the LED strip output had, which was A08. We'll type in save and hit enter. We'll then reconnect and go into the configuration tab. Here, we will want to enable servo tilt and click save and reboot. We'll then go into the servos tab. If you don't see this tab, make sure you have enabled expert mode. In here, we will set servo 0 to aux2, which is the same switch on the transmitter we are using to switch between stabilize mode and acro mode. We'll then go into the motors tab and check to make sure that servo 1 is adjusting between a PWM signal of 1000 and 2000. I'm using a 3-position switch, so it can also go to 1500. With that set up, we can plug in a battery, connect your FPV goggles, and you should be able to flip your aux2 switch on your transmitter and toggle back and forth between the two cameras. You should also see the video switcher light changing its blinking speed depending on the PWM signal it's receiving. This might be useful if you are troubleshooting at this step. With that functioning, we'll now go back into the Configuration tab in Betaflight and give our Mini QBiT a much better craft name. We'll hit save and reconnect and go to the OSD tab, where we will adjust things based on our personal preferences. Here, we can change the OSD output to change based on which camera we are looking out of. So we can have one OSD for hover and a second one for forward flight. In this case, I leave both hover and forward flight to have the same displays, but I turn off the artificial horizon and sidebars from the forward flight mode. Next, we'll go into the Adjustments tab and turn on the first adjustment and change the range to the full sweep. We'll then change the setting to the OSD profile selection and set both channels to aux2, which we are using to control the switch between hover and forward flight modes. Hit save, plug in a battery, and try the FPV view once more with the new OSD settings. Now we'll add some mixes in the transmitter for the control remapping, which is required due to the orientation change of the Mini QBiT. So that you understand, I've actually pulled this diagram from a paper that came out of our lab. Essentially, we need control remapping between hover and forward flight because the entire vehicle rotates 90 degrees. In hover, we have our standard pitch, roll, and yaw control of a standard quadcopter. However, when we transition to forward flight, the pitch remains the same, but the roll and yaw control flip. And not only that, roll control reverses direction. I'd recommend you understand what's going on here before adding your control mix, or you might be confused. So again, roll and yaw flip due to the orientation change of the vehicle, and roll reverses direction. So in the Tyrannus, we still have our aux2 set up, which we will use for our control remapping. Roll control affects channel 2, and yaw control affects channel 4. When we flip our aux2 switch, currently nothing changes between roll and yaw, so we need to essentially flip channel 2 and 4 and reverse channel 4 after the flip occurs. We'll go into the Mixer tab, scroll down to channel 2, copy channel 2, and paste it directly below itself. We'll then go up to the original first entry on channel 2 and click Edit. We'll then go to the switch setting and set the aux2 switch back and forth so that it registers and saves it as a control switch in the mix. In this case, hover mode occurs when the switch is set to its lowest position. So we want to make sure that the standard channel 2 mix is the one that is active when we are in hover mode, aka when the switch is at its lowest position. We'll then exit and go back to the general mixer menu. We'll go back to the second channel 2 entry we copy and pasted from earlier. We'll click Edit and change the source to the rudder stick, which we can do by simply moving the rudder stick back and forth until it changes from aileron to rudder. We'll then change the name of this particular mix to RUD, short for rudder, and this is our first control mix. We'll again go to the switch setting and set the aux2 switch to the position we are using for forward flight. So in this case, I'm using a 3-position switch. So I'm using the center and up positions for forward flight. Because I'm using a 3-position switch, I need to specify what happens when the switch is set in the full up position, as well as center. So I copy the second entry mix, click Edit, and then set the switch to the up position. Now when we switch the aux2 switch, we can see the different mixes that are given authority based on the position of the switch. The mix which is given control is bolded. Now we'll adjust the channel 4 mixes. Again, we'll copy and paste a second entry directly below the first within the same channel 4 mix. We'll then do the opposite as earlier. We go to the source, and this time we move the aileron stick and replace the rudder with aileron. We change the mix name to AIL, short for aileron. We then want to reverse channel 4. To do this, we'll simply set the weight from 100 to -100. We'll then go to the switch setting and set the aux2 switch for this mix to the center or up position, which we are using for forward flight. We go into the first entry, don't change anything, but we set the aux2 switch to the down position, which we are using to enable hover mode. Again, we copy the second entry and paste it directly below. We click Edit, and we set the position to the up position. Again, I'm using this because I'm using a 3-position switch, so I need to make sure the transmitter knows what to do if I set the position to the up position. And in this case, I'm making sure that the middle and up positions are used for forward flight. Now, back in the mixer menu, when I move the aux2 switch back and forth, you can see the different control mixes which are being activated. Now when we look at the channel monitor, hover mode should still work identically to earlier when our aux2 switch is set to the lowest position, aka hover mode. But when we flip the switch to the forward flight mode, channel 2 and channel 4 flip, and the channel 4 is reversed. In this way, your controls are consistently mapped to your camera view rather than the vehicle's orientation. This will make it much easier to fly, and I strongly recommend you include these mixes. You can also check to make sure that your control remapping was done correctly by looking at the preview in beta flight. Imagine that the quad rudder shown in the preview is an airplane when set to 90 degrees. This will help you make sure that your roll and yaw control remixing is done correctly. And just like that, your FPV Mini QBiT is done. Alright, so I've got my Mini QBiT here with the battery in it ready to go. Got my FPV goggles. I'm going to take it up and show you how to fly it. So first thing we want to do is make sure that the cameras are flipping correctly. So for that, I'm just going to physically switch between both cameras, so that's going to be with my little switch. And as we can see, it's working. I'm going to make sure that the nose cone camera is oriented the correct way, so I should be at the lower half of the screen when I'm standing in front of it. And sure enough, I'm at the lower half, so we're good there. And yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and take off. So I'm going to go into hover mode here. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is just check to make sure that my range is strong enough for both my transmitter and my video signal. And they both seem okay. I'm going to have to point this way a little bit. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and try and transition into forward flight. So for that, I'm just going to essentially just give a small amount of pitch input forward. Just the slightest bit. You might need a little bit of extra throttle in order to go forward. You can just barely see the ground moving below me. And then once I feel comfortable, I'm going to go ahead and flip their switch, which will translate us from stabilized mode to acro mode. And it'll do the control remapping and then also change the OSD display like we have it set up. Alright, so here we go. 3, 2, 1. A little bit of pitch forward input, stabilizing, and we're good. We're in forward flight. It's just that easy. You really don't need a lot of pitch input in order to transition. You just need the smallest amount, very, very little amount of pitch input to get that transition working. It's a little bit of a breezy day today, and there's also actually a little bit of a rain coming down right now. But she's flying perfectly fine, and she feels great. For a kind of a low pass here, throttle up, yaw over, give a little bit of roll back in order to coordinate it, and we're good. Again, there's a good amount of wind going on right now, so I'm kind of in a bit of giving a little bit of left roll in order to keep my position. But we'll go ahead and transition into forward flight in 3, 2, 1, small amount of pitch input, transition, a little bit of blip of the throttle to get their speed up, and we're in forward flight. So it's quite simple once you get the hang of it. But you know, you want to be careful with that pitch input again, because what can happen is you can give too much pitch input and you'll nosedive into the ground, which is what I did initially, and that's pretty common. So you want to just be very careful with that, and also give yourself a good amount of altitude as well, so that you've got a little bit of mistakes that you can account for with your altitude. And so let's say something bad happens. Let's say something goes wrong and you're not feeling comfortable. You can flip your switch and boom, we're back into a hover. So it's it's really that easy. I'll go ahead and transition again. You know, once you get good at it, it's really quite natural, and you don't really have to think about it too much. I'll come back again, and I'll do that transition maneuver once more, go into a hover. So yeah, it's quite easy. Wow, it's starting to actually rain. Thankfully, pretty much everything on this thing is waterproof because of that nose cone. But I might go in my car here and wait out this rain and go fly again. Alright, so it appears the rain has stopped, so I'm going to go ahead and take her up again. Alright, so again, to do this transition maneuver, I'm going to come over here, somewhere where I feel like I'm pretty comfortable flying. Gonna give myself a little bit of altitude, nothing too crazy. We'd rather be low and hit the ground and rather than be really high and risk breaking something. So about 30 feet up is probably good, right about around here. I'm gonna give a small amount of pitch input to get into forward flight, a little bit of throttle to keep my altitude, and then we're gonna go ahead and flip our switch and go into forward flight. So we're gonna go from stabilized mode into acro mode in 3, 2, 1.
And now we're in forward flight mode, which is again acro mode, so it's just that easy. Just a small amount of pitch input is all you need, and you really don't need anything more than that.